Greetings everyone, and peace be upon those who follow guidance. In this video, we are going to be discussing a verse of the Quran which has gained some ridicule by certain people in the ex-Muslim sphere due to a common misunderstanding that is found even amongst Muslims. The verse is found in chapter 18, verse 85, which deals with the Spirit. In the verse, the Quran mentions a question which was posed to the Prophet about the Spirit. The verse reads, "And they ask you about the Spirit, O Muhammad, tell them, the Spirit is from the command of my Lord, but you have not been given of the knowledge except a little." According to the traditional narrative of this verse, this question was one of three questions which were raised to the Prophet by a certain group of Jewish scholars. The story goes as follows: some of the Meccan Arabs ran out of ways to challenge the Quranic narrative as well as its rhetoric, so they went to some of the Jewish scholars who were familiar with the revelations of God. The Jewish scholars told them to ask the Prophet three questions, about the companions of the cave, the story of the man who traveled to the ends of the earth, and finally about the Spirit. For the sake of simplicity, we are only going to be focusing on the question about the Spirit for now, and perhaps in a later video we will cover the other questions. Safe to say that the story has no basis whatsoever. One of the glaring issues with the story is the peculiarity of the Jewish scholars asking these questions to the Prophet, for the story of the young men in the cave is only relevant to Christians and not Jews, and the same goes for the story of the so-called Spirit. Furthermore, according to several other narrations, the Prophet was first asked about the Spirit while he was in Medina, and not in Mecca. Yet, according to this story, it was the Meccan Arabs who asked him about these three things while he was in Mecca, as they could not come up with ways to respond to the Quran. It is quite astounding how uninformed people of the ex-Muslim community can be when it comes to checking certain information. It amazes me that, though many claim to apply their faculty of reason when critiquing the Quran, there is barely much substance in much of what they say, especially when one examines the verses and sources which they quote. That's not to say that these stories don't exist within the Muslim sphere, but what is even the more strange, is that even after their supposed enlightenment after leaving Islam, they still fail to be intellectually thorough when commenting on the Quran. They maintain the same level of thought that they had while they were Muslims, and they still do not question whether or not some of the stories they love to cite in their ridicule and critique of the Quran are actually founded in actual critical thought. I personally do not mind someone critiquing the Quran, in fact I very much do welcome it, especially if their position is founded on thorough examination and thought. However, I have found that much of that is just as lacking in the ex-Muslim sphere as it is in the Muslim sphere. Perhaps, some of them do in fact know this information, but yet fail to mention it, and yet others perhaps are just merely misinformed, which in of itself is not a criticism, as we all can fall prey to misinformation. Anyway, continuing on with the conversation. The Spirit in this verse, as understood by those who find fault with the Quran, is supposedly a reference to the breath of life which God breathed into the human being, and to others it is a reference to the Holy Spirit who is the third person of the Trinity. Those who criticize the Quran say that the Prophet did not understand the intent of the question, and as such he answered the question by shutting down their immediate inquiry. The problem with this argument is that these people fail to understand how the Quran communicates. When the Quran says, "And they ask you about such and such," this does not mean that the people are asking about the innate nature of the subject matter. For example, when the Quran says, "And they ask you about menstruation," this does not mean that they are asking him about the ins and outs of menstruation or about its pathophysiology. Rather, the intent of the question is within the answer to the question. When the Prophet is asked about menstruation, the question is intended to be pertaining to the permissibility or impermissibility of sexual relations with a woman during her menstrual cycle, which the Quran outrightly condemns by calling it something harmful, meaning that sexual relations with a woman in her menses is something harmful to the woman and should therefore be avoided at all costs. All other questions that follow a similar pattern function in the same way. So, when the Quran says, "They ask you about the Spirit," what they wanted to know was, by whose authority had it been sent to the prophet, not about its nature, hence why the verse responds by saying that it is from the command of God. Now, with that out of the way, let us get to the crux of the conversation. What is the spirit that is mentioned in this verse? As previously mentioned, those who find fault with the Quran assume that the spirit mentioned in the verse is a reference to that thing which was breathed into the human being or to the Holy Spirit. However, this is a false interpretation of the verse. This verse is actually a reference to the revelation itself, rather than to some unknown entity. The Quran is itself a spirit which has been revealed to the prophet. We see in chapter 42, verse 52, the following, "And thus have we inspired to you, O Muhammad, a spirit from our command. You did not use to know what the prescribed law was, as well as what was fidelity. However, we have made it a light by which we guide whomever we will of our servants, and you, O Muhammad, do indeed guide to a straight path." According to this verse, God inspired to the prophet a spirit from his command by which he guides people, that spirit being of course the Quran. Similarly, when we look at the verse in question found in chapter 17, we see in verse 86, that the subject matter is also about the Quran. The verse reads as follows, "And if we had wished, we surely could have done away with that which we have inspired to you, O Muhammad, and then you would not find for yourself an advocate against us." Now, as can be observed, this verse is similarly referencing the Quran, informing the prophet that had God willed, he certainly could have taken away that which he has revealed to the prophet, i.e. the Quran, and then the prophet would be left without an advocate. Please note that these verses employ the same wordings. The thing which was inspired to the prophet in chapter 42 was the Quran, and in that verse it is referred to as a spirit, and this spirit is one which comes from the command of God, which is again seen in verse 86 of chapter 17, which says that, had God wished, he could have taken away that which he had inspired to the prophet, i.e. the Quran. No one is in doubt that this verse here is a reference to the Quran, yet they all assume that the verse prior to this, i.e. verse 85, is referring to something other than the Quran. This verse comes right after the question of the Spirit, and these two verses, 85 and 86, are combined in reference to in chapter 42 about a spirit which God had inspired to the prophet. Furthermore, we can look at the following verses as well, to further clarify what this is actually talking about. Verses 87 to 89 read as follows, "Rather, it is a mercy from your Lord, O Muhammad, assuredly, his grace upon you is indeed ever momentous. Say, O Muhammad, if the people and the jinn were to gather together to produce the like of this Quran, they would never come up with its like, and even if some of them were to assist one another, as we have certainly expounded for the people in this Quran of all sorts of examples, but the majority of people refuse anything except if it were dishonorable conduct." As can be observed in these verses, the spirit here can only be a reference to the Quran itself. So, when the people asked the prophet about the spirit, they were inquiring of whose authority the Quran had been inspired to the prophet, and that is why the verse responds that it is from the command of God. Now, let us round off by taking a look at the verses together, from verses 85 to 89, and try and see the bigger picture. The verses are as follows, "And they ask you, O Muhammad, about the spirit, i.e. the inspiration, tell them, the spirit, i.e. the inspiration, is from the command of my Lord, but you have not been given of the knowledge except a little. And if we had wished, we surely could have done away with that which we have inspired to you, O Muhammad, and then you would not find for yourself an advocate against us. Rather, it is a mercy from your Lord, O Muhammad, assuredly, his grace upon you is indeed ever momentous. Say, O Muhammad, if the people and the jinn were to gather together to produce the like of this Quran, they would never come up with something of its like, and even if they were to assist one another. And we have certainly expounded for the people in this Quran of all sorts of examples, but the majority of people refuse anything except if it were dishonorable conduct." As always, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Take care of yourselves, and peace be upon those who follow the true guidance.